Well, Damascus has fallen, and this news is sending shockwaves throughout the Middle East, in fact, throughout the world. And it's got a lot of people talking about centuries-old prophecies regarding the fall of Damascus, about Syria, about wars in the Middle East. And in this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to talk about these things and how it affects you and I as followers of the Messiah.
If you enjoy watching this and other great content from Jacob's Tent, download the Jacob's Tent app today. Gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
Well, welcome once again to the Weekly Scroll, everyone. Several weeks ago, maybe even months ago now, I shared with our congregation, and on this platform as well, that I am convinced that we are in a season when God is humiliating his enemies and he's eliminating those who have incited his anger because they have opposed his people and his purpose. This thinking started to materialize as the news reported more and more leaders in Hamas and Hezbollah and even in Iran were beginning to fall. Some of them with the help of Israeli soldiers in the IDF or agents in the Mossad, or in the case of Iran's president, by a mysterious helicopter crash. Well, this weekend, the retribution or the reckoning, whichever word you prefer, I believe both of them apply, saw another name added to the list of fallen leaders from among those who oppose God's people. After 50-plus years of rule under the House of Assad, Bashar al-Assad, a ruthless dictator, had to flee Syria and seek asylum in Russia. Assad was forced to flee the country after a coalition of mostly radical Islamist groups swept across Syria and eventually capturing the country's capital city of Damascus. And that signaled the end of Assad's rule over the nation. This final offensive that, from my point of view anyway, seemed to come out of nowhere. At least those of us in the United States, it seems that way, because we've been preoccupied with our own internal strife. Well, anyway, this final offensive was the latest development in a civil war that has continued for almost 14 years now. And you may recall this Syrian civil war started during the Obama years, and it started in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring. In turn, the Arab Spring created an environment that gave rise to groups such as ISIS, and it provided the catalyst for basically what has culminated in the overthrow of Assad's regime. Now, on that note, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had this to say: "This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but is also fraught with significant dangers." Netanyahu claimed that the fall of Assad's regime was a, quote, direct result of Israeli attacks on Iran and Hezbollah. He said this: "This collapse is the direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression." The collapse of the Syrian regime has had impact upon Syria's security forces as well. And that is a fact that elicited this comment from Netanyahu. He said, "This also means that we have to take action against possible threats." This is Netanyahu speaking. One of them is the collapse of the separation of forces agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. And he went on to say that this agreement held for 50 years, but last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. So we gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. In short, IDF paratroopers and heavily armed tanks took up positions that had been abandoned by the Syrian army near the border with Israel, which includes the Syrian side of Mount Hermon, a fact that I find very interesting. Now, the IDF said that this deployment was meant to, quote, proactively ensure the defense of Golan and the instability in Syria. This particular move comes as both the United States and Israel struck multiple targets inside Syria, including ISIS strongholds and chemical weapons plants. Now, you may recall that Assad used these chemical weapons on his own civilians when former President Barack Obama was in office. The United States and Israel are said to be taking these steps to ensure that those weapons do not fall into the hands of the Islamist extremists now in control of Syria. And for just a moment, we want to talk about these people. About 6 months ago, the opposition groups in Syria communicated to Turkey their plans for a major offensive against the Syrian army. And apparently, these insurgents felt that they had received some sort of approval from Turkey, and so then they moved to implement this plan. And so then, just 2 weeks ago, they seized Syria's second city, Aleppo, and took almost everyone by surprise. And then, in just a little more than a week following that, they reached Damascus. And on this past Sunday, they put an end to 5 decades of Assad family rule. Now, as for Bashar al-Assad, his army was demoralized. They were exhausted. His main allies, Iran and Hezbollah, had been severely weakened by the conflict with Israel. And his other main military supporter, Russia, has been distracted, you might say, by its own conflict with Ukraine. It was as if all of this were the result of the perfect storm. And if it was a perfect storm, we certainly know who arranges those. Now, as far as the insurgents themselves, the most notable of them is a man called Abu Muhammad al-Golani. That's what he goes by. But his real name is Ahmad al-Shara'a. And though he has recently renounced his association, Golani has longtime connections to al-Qaeda. This man and his fellow revolutionaries now control Damascus, and it would seem, to some degree anyway, the fate of Syria. To say the least, how this turns out is uncertain. Syria is home to multiple ethnic and religious communities, and those communities are often pitted against one another. There are a lot of people who fear that Sunni Islamist extremists will take over. Turkey, an increasing belligerent nation as far as Israel is concerned, they have their own interest in this particular matter. The current uncertainty provoked one military intelligence analyst, Rebecca Koffler, to offer this assessment. Quote, "Who will fill the void? The rebels aren't good people. They're the same extremists we've seen before." Now, while they may appear on Western media wearing a green t-shirt, she says, and giving polished interviews, the reality is different. Removing one dictator often leads to even worse outcomes, as we saw in Libya and in Iraq. As a matter of fact, al-Golani is currently, right now, labeled a terrorist by the United States. His ties to al-Qaeda reach back to 2003. This man fought against U.S. troops in Iraq. He was involved with al-Qaeda when that terror group formed the extremist Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Some of these names can really mess you up. Anyway, he doesn't sound like one of the good guys. His fighting force, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, or it's called HTS for short. This fighting force includes many fighters who are jihadis, and this is the force that will most likely be a major player in the coming days. And I should also point out that this Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, that word right there, the Levant includes the land known as Israel. Now, in the U.S., leaders here in the U.S., leaders in Israel, have applauded the fall of Assad, but also have expressed grave concerns about who is actually going to lead the country moving forward. These concerns are, I would say, obviously valid. Just as an example of the uncertainty, this past Saturday, the IDF assisted UN forces in resisting an insurgent attack against a UN post in the Hadar area of Syria. And so there's a lot of things going on, a lot of things that are just unstable right now. Still, President Biden had this to say, quote, "At long last, the Assad regime has fallen. The fall of this regime is a fundamental act of justice. It is a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their country. It is also a moment of risk and uncertainty. President-elect Donald Trump had this to say on social media: Assad is gone. He has fled his country. His protector, Russia, was not interested in protecting him any longer. They lost all interest in Syria because of Ukraine, where close to 600,000 Russian soldiers lay wounded or dead. And then Trump went on to say, Syria is a mess, but is not our friend, and the United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. However, the United States Central Command, CENTCOM, said forces had conducted dozens of airstrikes on Islamic State targets in central Syria, went on to say that these strikes were aimed to ensure that the Islamic State does not take advantage of the current situation in Syria. To say the least, these developments have created shockwaves throughout the region and throughout the world. And after so many decades of involvement, not to mention vast amounts of money, Russia and Iran are now scrambling to manage the fallout. The implications for these two nations, as well as others in the region, are profound, and I believe personally that they have prophetic implications. In other words, retaining a foothold in the Middle East has always been a cornerstone of Moscow's strategy. There are currently Russian air and naval bases that serve as vital assets, but with Assad now gone, those Syrian-based assets are at risk. At least in the short term, this development represents a strategic defeat for Russia, perhaps costing them anyway, critical bases in the Middle East, even as they are stretched and their military resources are far-flung in this ongoing war with Ukraine. In a nutshell, this particular incident, coupled with the inability to conclude the matter with Ukraine in a conclusive way, has made Russia look weak. Some analysts even speculate that with Assad's overthrow, Trump may have newfound leverage over Putin, which then might open a path for Trump to negotiate the end of the war in Ukraine. Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I would also contribute this thought. The embarrassment that Russia is now having to endure, the loss of influence that they're having to suffer within the Middle East, not to mention appearing weak in contrast to the United States, might, and I want to underscore might, cause Putin to double down on his resolve to be relevant in the world, and specifically in the Middle East. This embarrassment might be the very thing that leads to something the Bible reveals about a leader of the land called Magog. And it says in verse 10 of Ezekiel 38, thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. The other loser in this situation, a nation who will also figure prominently in the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 9, is Iran. Syria was a crucial link in Tehran's axis of resistance, connecting Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, thus enabling the smuggling of weapons throughout the region. The ring of fire that had been established around Israel is crumbling before our eyes. And the fall of Assad, it's a big exclamation point on the statement that, at least as far as I believe, that God is making in the earth right now. Again, the elimination of Hamas's top leaders, the decimation of Hamas's ability to terrorize was just the start of this. And then it was followed by the weakening of Hezbollah at the hands of the IDF, and that further amplified Assad's vulnerability. It basically left him without any critical support. You see, Hezbollah has been an important force assisting Assad's army during this 14-year civil war. But after they incurred heavy losses, Hezbollah could no longer provide adequate support. And for all of their bravado, Iran sent no additional troops to support Assad. Actually, it's being reported that a majority of Iranians are celebrating Assad's downfall. Many Iranians see the constant support of Assad as depleting the Iranian people's wealth. And so then, with Assad gone, there's hope in the nation that Iran's negative influence in the region will weaken. In other words, there are those in Iran who are hoping that tyrannical regimes such as Assad's are not the last to fall. Now, on that note, a prominent Israeli analyst feels that Assad's demise translates into a potential upside for both the United States and for Israel. We shall see, but I will say this. The Bible seems, and I want to emphasize that word, seems, to describe a time before the Messiah's return and before the climactic battles that spell the end of the age, when the people of Israel are dwelling in peace. Perhaps it's in part because their enemy to the north, Syria, is, these are my words, neutralized. Isaiah 17 says, "Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aurora are forsaken." Many years ago, I would even say decades now, I felt this particular prophecy about the destruction of Damascus would be fulfilled during a time of war, and a war I assumed would be fought between the Syrians and Israel and maybe other regional powers. However, when the Syrian civil war got into full swing many years ago, and seeing block after city block of Damascus being reduced to rubble, I began to wonder if the city might not be destroyed from within. So now with these recent developments, I can see how either of these scenarios, I mean, a war that breaks out or just a ruination from within, or maybe a combination of both, I could see how both of those scenarios could result in what is being described in Isaiah 17. I would also point out that there will be cities, and that word is plural as you see it in the text, cities of Aurora that will be destroyed or be affected at the very least. And Aurora is a region that is located in present-day Jordan, but was once in the region deeded to the tribe of Gad in the area known as Gilead. And so my point is, along with Damascus, whatever happens in Damascus and to Damascus to fulfill this prophecy is apparently going to spill over and affect other cities, towns, regions in the area. And this particular one that's mentioned happens to be in present-day Jordan. And so the point is this. If Damascus to the north is eradicated, and that also affects, from Israel's point of view, threats to the east in present-day Jordan, and given the fact that Ezekiel 35, 36, and 37 describe a decisive war with Edom, who a lot of people believe, myself included, is alluding to the so-called Palestinians, then we may be on the verge of something incredible, not to mention extremely prophetic. I'll be the first to say that just when we think we've gotten it all figured out, prophetically speaking, something changes that we didn't see coming, like this capture of Damascus by these insurgents. But even though we don't see these things coming, when we see these things take place, then we realize that it was written, all that it has always been written in the scripture. It's just maybe we didn't notice it. And it's on that note that I want to return to the notion that there might be a small window of time before Messiah returns, before these apocalyptic battles take place, when Israel dwells in relative peace. Now, when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes. It might even be that this space of time when Israel has peace is the very thing that puts a hook in the jaw in the confederation of nations who swoop down on the mountains of Israel like a cloud. Nations like Persia, which is Iran, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, and the house of Togarmah from the north, who many believe to be Turkey. The prophecy in Ezekiel says that this army is going to come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate, and now all of them dwell safely. It goes on to say that the invaders will say, "I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls. having neither bars nor gates, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited. So more than once, this prophecy mentions a region that had been regarded as the waste places or being desolate. And I consider that to be interesting language because that is exactly how the ancient heights, an area claimed by God's enemies, namely Edom, and they claim it as their possession. That's how these ancient heights are described in Ezekiel 36. The inference, in other words, is those who made such claims in Ezekiel 36 that these ancient heights are ours no longer have possession of those ancient heights. Now add this to the fact that the fallen armies of God in Ezekiel 38 and 9 will be buried in Israel. The Bible is quite clear on that matter. However, the particular place where they are buried in Israel is currently in the country of Jordan. A point? No one knows exactly what to expect, but it could be that we are at the threshold of something monumental. Now, I want to point out one other thing. When all these nations gathered together to come against the land of Israel, here's what God says to Gog. On that day, when my people Israel dwells safely, will you not know it? More than once, the prophecy says that Israel is dwelling in safety. They're at peace. That's what point I was trying to make here. But we also see that there are nations who do not like the fact that Israel is dwelling safely in the land. And obviously, they intend to rectify the situation to better suit their agenda. And when they do invade the land of Israel, one particular nation is curiously and conspicuously missing from the list: Syria. That's odd, don't you think? Why aren't they mentioned? Maybe it's because when this occurs, Syria is essentially non-existent. I don't mean that to say that there are no more Syrians, just to say, or maybe to suggest, that the land of Syria is divided into different factions with no effective government or military, which is a potential outcome of what we see going on right now. Now, let's consider this. If Israel has anything to do with Damascus being destroyed, with cities in Jordan being affected by this, the heights that are claimed by some called Edom are no longer in their hands, but are in the hands of Israel, and all these things are creating this big upheaval in Syria and Jordan and the so-called West Bank. If Israel's got anything to do with that, then the nations who seek Israel's destruction, aided by those who have always wanted to be a force to be reckoned with in the world and in the Middle East, then all those nations will have their reason, to strike at the tiny land of Israel. Again, we can't be certain of just how things turn out, but one thing I am certain of: I can hear the footsteps of the Messiah getting closer and closer.
If you enjoyed these videos and value our content here at Jacob's Tent, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and never miss the latest info and insights from Bill and the team. Most of all, you can help us spread the message. By sharing these videos with others, you'll be helping to grow our interactive community together.